not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
That was the voice of a man who was giving his inaugural address as President of the United States. A voice that the whole world came to love. A voice that was to be stilled before those who had once hated him had a chance to tell him that they had come to love him. A voice that spoke for freedom and justice and equality and all the things that hallow and sanctify the dignity of man. His name, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I can't be accused of American sentimentalism, for I am not an American. I am a Canadian, an average Canadian. And I think I speak for all average Canadians. As a matter of fact, I believe I speak for all average non-Americans, regardless of nationality, color, or creed. I run a radio program in Montreal, Canada, and from time to time, I give an editorial on my show. One day, a couple of years ago, a fella called me up on November the 22nd and said, "Pat, I'm surprised." I said, "Surprised at what?" Well, he said, "Today is November the 22nd, and I was sure you'd say something about the late President Kennedy. And you know, Pat, I've listened to all of your broadcasts, and I've heard you from time to time mention Kennedy. And from what I've heard, I was sure he was your kind of guy." I said he was, and that he was right in censuring me for not mentioning the anniversary of the late President Kennedy's death. But I promised him that I would say something about it on my night show. And you know, it wasn't really difficult, because he was right. The late John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, was my kind of guy. And it shows how self-centered we can be when we fail to think of what others meant to us because we are so busy with our own selfish pursuits. Yeah, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was my kind of guy. And I'll tell you why. Not because of the image he projected of a handsome and rich husband and father. Not because he had the glamour of which all of us seem to be so conscious and so susceptible to. But because John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a man who cared. Some of us have to overcome poverty in our efforts to understand the troubled feelings of our fellow man. He had a greater obstacle to overcome: wealth. Born the second son of a wealthy father, John Kennedy could have lived a life of comfort and ease, the like of which most of us dream about. And our dreams remain but that. Dreams. Instead, he chose the hard and uncertain path of dedicating his life to his fellow Americans and his country. After graduating from Harvard, he entered the service of his country in the same manner as did a million other Americans, and almost lost his life when the boat, of which he was the commander, was sunk by the Japanese. You know, it says something for the humility of the man that when asked by a child why he was decorated in the war, he replied very simply, "They sunk my boat." This was the young man from Massachusetts who was later to run as a congressman and win, and still later as a senator for his home state of Massachusetts and win. And typical of the man, he won against odds, beating out Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican who was thought to be unbeatable in that part of the world, particularly during the year 1952, when the popular General Dwight D. Eisenhower was making it easy for the Republicans to win anywhere in the United States. He was still an obscure senator. The glister of gold was not yet to be seen for some years. In the meantime, he took pen in hand and wrote a book which won him the Pulitzer Prize, the highest honor that can be bestowed on any American author. He ran for the vice presidency in 1956 at the Democratic Convention, but lost. He was not yet 40. Time and boundless energy were still on his side. 2 years later, he decided he would become the President of the United States and set himself to the task of fulfilling his ambition and desire in a manner never before seen in that country of ambition and miracles. Again, the odds were against him. And I was, too. He was a Roman Catholic, and I feared that religion, not reason, would guide his hand as complex decisions of state had to be met. When the battle opened with the Virginia primary, I was hoping against hope that John Fitzgerald Kennedy would lose. Against all the odds, he won. And he kept on winning, primary after primary. Finally came the Democratic Convention of 1960, the same convention which 4 years earlier had rejected his bid to become the vice president. But this time, he was not to be denied. I personally was an Adlai-Stevenson man all the way. I was bitterly opposed to Kennedy and was dejected when the roll call of states continued to cast their ballots in Kennedy's favor and his majority mounted. He won hands down. He won because he deserved to win. He overcame enormous odds. His wealth, his youth, his religion. Then the election campaign itself. It was as close as your next heartbeat. But he finally won out over Richard Nixon and became the 35th President of the United States. His inaugural address had something of Lincoln in it. The man's stature grew with every sentence. He called his administration the New Frontier, and he made it clear that the old frontier of poverty and injustice and ignorance for the masses was not compatible with his high ideals. My fears and prejudices and bigotry melted as he hammered away at his theme like a blacksmith forging a steel shoe on the anvil of truth and justice. I was still reluctant to believe that this man would be what he appeared to be to the vast masses, and my prejudices died hard. But little by little, those prejudices disappeared. Truth is the most powerful antidote known to man. Ultimately, even the bigot must succumb. And I did. I saw in John Fitzgerald Kennedy something the United States had not seen since the great Abraham Lincoln. The Lincoln who often inspired him. The Lincoln whom he so often quoted. John Fitzgerald Kennedy meant to me the living embodiment of Abraham Lincoln in a world that was as beset with troubles as was the United States itself 100 years ago. It is significant, or perhaps it is one of those tricks which posterity plays. I don't know which. That Lincoln was elected in 1860, whereas Kennedy was elected in 1960, exactly 100 years later. The problems that Lincoln had to deal with were the same as those which Kennedy had to deal with. But there was one big difference. The United States was now the leader of the entire free world. On the shoulders of the President of the United States in 1960 rested the outcome of the battle between freedom and slavery. Whereas in 1860, the battle between freedom and slavery, as far as the United States was concerned, was confined within the borders of the United States itself. The heir to Lincoln proved himself to be worthy of the task. He stooped to conquer. Not for him the high and mighty posture of some of his predecessors. He saw freedom in its true light, without barriers of race, religion, or color. And he fought to obtain that freedom for every human being. If Lincoln emancipated the slaves, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was determined to make the great Emancipation Proclamation more than just printer's ink. He would not compromise in an area where compromise would have been both understandable and expedient. The Civil Rights Bill had to be passed, or the American eagle would be nothing but a vulture eating away the bones of true freedom. When big business, the steel industry, attempted to line their own pockets with the sweat of the common man and make every American's burden harder to bear, it was John Fitzgerald Kennedy who proved to be their champion and who would not stand idly by. He fought back on behalf of every person who could not fight for himself. And he made the steel tycoons back down. Here indeed was a Lincoln reincarnated. When freedom was imperiled, he did not flag or fail or flinch from the responsibility imposed upon him as President of the United States. He stood resolute and firm against the international menace of communism. Berlin, that island of freedom in a sea of tyranny, had John Fitzgerald Kennedy as its guiding light. When international communism moved to the North American and South American hemispheres, John Fitzgerald Kennedy did not shirk his duties. He was prepared to fight for the only thing worth fighting for on this earth: freedom. when this man was struck down by an assassin's bullet, it was as though a light had been extinguished from the earth, the like of which we have never seen in our lifetime, perhaps, and may not see again. Yes, he was everything a statesman, a champion of the underdog, and a fighter for freedom ought to be. And I am reminded of Macaulay's poem, Horatius on the Bridge, when he says, "Now who will stand on either hand to keep the bridge with me? The bridge of freedom with John Fitzgerald Kennedy as its captain." We lost that captain when a sniper's bullet on November the 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, tore away not a man, but a mountain for truth and freedom. We shall never see his like again in our time. Do you know anything about Good Friday? You know, it's really a very simple story, and a very tragic one. It's simple because the whole story is about a man who was unjustly put to death. And it's tragic because I believe he died in vain. His name was Jesus Christ, and he was the greatest man that ever lived. Yeah, I can hear you saying it. What? You, Pat? An atheist? Saying Christ was the greatest man that ever lived? My answer to that is, truth is incontrovertible. I may not be a good Christian by your standards, because I never go to church, but I may be a Christian by Christ's standards, because he had no church. All humanity was his parish. Why do I say he died in vain? Well, you'll be offended when I tell you. I don't believe you lived by his teachings and his example. If you did, we would not have so much poverty in our midst. You know, for an unbeliever, I think Jesus Christ quite a guy. I'm not going to pretend that I can recall or recount his life. His greatness exceeds the greatness of any pen. Words are inadequate to convey the majesty of the being. But I may be permitted on this day to briefly sketch the outline of the greatest man that ever lived and died because he believed in you and me. A trust and a confidence which I believe and I fear was misplaced. Born the son of a carpenter, he first saw the light of day in a stable. Much has been recorded of his birth, including the divine guidance of the three wise men who brought him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But you know, the infant in the manger didn't want gold or frankincense or myrrh. The infant wanted tolerance and understanding and compassion and charity. There is no record of his early years, except that we are told that at a very early age, he addressed the elders in the temple and amazed them with his wisdom. This is not surprising, for Jesus Christ was to amaze all mankind. At the age of 30, he started his ministry. He was an itinerant preacher who tried to show the path of truth and righteousness to a very small band of followers. He walked among the multitude, preaching love and charity and tolerance. He healed the sick and the blind and the maimed and the halt with a humility that of itself was not greatness, but which surpassed greatness. He never built a church, never commanded an army, a navy, or an air force. He never owned a business. He never held a political office. But he was nevertheless the most successful man this earth has ever known. For he captured the dominion of all power, the minds of men. And he did it by example. No human was too small or insignificant for the great man to help. He stooped to conquer, and in stooping, he cured the leper, reformed the prostitute, gave sight to the blind, and made the lame and the halt to walk. For these benefactions, he asked nothing, except that others believe. There were few who did. The rest of the populace scorned, ridiculed, and condemned him. He finally drew unto himself 12 persons who believed in what he said. These 12 were to be known by history as the 12 apostles, followers of the greatest man that ever lived. He continued his sojourn among the people, bringing comfort where there was misery, hope where there was despair, and health where there was sickness. No man was so poor that he could not obtain his charity, and no man so rich that he could buy it. At the age of 33, he was brought before the Roman consul Pilate, turned over to his enemies, and nailed to a cross on Calvary. The only thing he owned at the time of his death was the garment he wore. But he left a greater legacy to mankind than the richest man that ever lived. If we have not used this legacy properly, do not blame him. Blame ourselves. We are a society corrupted by the god of materialism. We are devoid of mercy and compassion. Unlike the great master, we do not believe we are our brother's keeper. We have perverted the great man's teachings to suit our own ends. Man today lusts for power and pursues that lust with a passionate zeal. And we call ourselves Christians. It is significant that Calvary is the most famous mountain in the world today. Vesuvius spews out death. The Himalayas represent a challenge. But only Calvary offers a hope. And the man who made Calvary the most famous mountain was nailed to a cross for all mankind. He knew of no distinction between rich and poor, young and old, or black and white. He ennobled and enriched thought itself, by elevating all mankind to its highest pinnacle. You can probably hear in the background the strains of the hymn, "Onward, Christian Soldiers." But observe the words, marching as to war. This does not mean war in the sense that we understand or know it. Killing other human beings for some temporary or imagined gain. It means war in the only context that makes sense. War against injustice, intolerance, poverty, disease, sickness. This, and this alone, is what is meant by the words, "Onward, Christian Soldiers." If it doesn't mean that, then it means nothing. Because the greatest man that ever lived died to preserve these principles. If you believe in him, then believe in what he stood for. Fight for what he stood for, which is the hallowed sanctity of the dignity